very interesting. I'd say so. Okay. So moving on to the next, continuing kind of in this similar field of general analysis of the concept of God. Our next speaker is Professor Rebecca Chun. I think she's here. Yeah, I saw her earlier, so I hope she's still here. She'll be exploring some of the philosophical issues that come up when dealing with the concept of God. So as an introduction, Professor Chang is an assistant professor of philosophy at San Jose State University in California. On top of researching and teaching there, she's also a university director of pre-law advising. She primarily works in the intersection of metaphysics and normativity. This mainly comprises a focus on kind of the relationship between what the world is like and normative facts, that is roughly about value and what we ought to do. She's presently interested in the implications of the relationship for this relationship for persons. On this, she interacts with issues in practical reason, free will, and identity. She also applies her research to other areas of philosophy, such as philosophy of law, philosophy of religion, and applied ethics. So again, her talk is today about philosophical issues with the concept of God. So, Rebecca, if you're there, you can unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you. It's nice to meet everyone and
Likewise.
be at this workshop. Let me try to share my screen real quick. I have a handout. Cool. Can everyone see this? Awesome. Thank you. Okay. So I'm going to talk about some philosophical issues with the concept of God. And I also want to say these are mostly like Western philosophical issues, though perhaps there will be a little bit of overlap with some other traditions. And I think what I want to do is start by just talking about attributes in general. So what are divine attributes? Well, very roughly, attributes are what constitute a thing's essence. And so we might think of them as being core features that are part of our concept of what a thing is. So we can talk about these in terms of like ordinary things or perhaps substances. And then in the case of divine attributes, they're going to be what constitute God's essence or form our concept of God, right? There are a lot of questions surrounding which attributes are the divine ones. So I think the three most popular are probably the ones that a lot of intro to philosophy students hear if they ever talk about God or philosophy of religion or the problem of evil. And those are going to be omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence. Like put very roughly, you might just think, oh, these mean that God is like maximally powerful, knowledgeable, good, etc. There are like actually a lot of interesting problems in the way you formulate each of these attributes. We might get to that in a little bit. But for now, those are just three of the more popular ones. There's other ones that come up frequently in the literature. So for example, necessary existence plays a large role. Then you also have things like impassibility or omnipresence, simplicity, transcendence, personality, incorporeality. There's just like a very long list of things that have been attributed to God and are thought to be part of the concept of God. Then there are ones that maybe less popular isn't the correct term to use, but are more religion specific. So for example, God is triune comes up a lot in Christian traditions, but this doesn't really come up in other monotheistic traditions like Islam or Judaism. You might think that it's important that God is like an important attribute is mercifulness, or that God is the creator. So these are all different proposed attributes that have been associated with the concept of God. Before diving into looking more closely at some of them, I want to propose that we think about why these matter. And so one pretty clear way in which they matter is that if you take seriously that the divine attributes are constituting God's essence, then it looks like you're going to get a claim something like this is going to be true. So God's going to exist if and only if there is some being who has the divine attributes. All right. So like the significant thing going on is that these attributes are picking out what it is to be God. And so like the test for like whether God exists is going to be pretty straightforward. We just like look in the world, see if something has all of these attributes. If so, that thing is God, right? So that's sort of like the big ontological upshot. And the other way in which these matter is that they've played a really prominent role in philosophical arguments. All right, so for example, Anselm's ontological argument defines God as that than which no greater can be conceived. And so you find this type of thing coming up a lot in perfect being theology. It's not just that this is our concept of what God is, it's that we can use this concept to do cool things like purportedly demonstrate the existence of God, right? You can see the reverse come up. So some people take these attributes and then use them to try to demonstrate that God does not exist. So like a very popular case where this arises is the problem of evil. So you always have to start with God being omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. Then you can get the rest of the problem of evil to work, right? So they also matter philosophically in terms of arguments about whether or not God exists. Okay. Framed in that way, I do think there's this interesting issue about whether imperfect being theology is a live option, all right? So this connects a little bit to the former talk where we look at like what the non-philosophers and non-theologians think, right? So if we look at like the actual scriptures of some of these major monotheistic religion traditions, I think there is a live textual question about whether the scripture itself contains a perfect being conception of God. So there's actually like very little textual support for this in, say, the Torah or the Bible or the Quran, all right? So if we think that this is like a live option, then we can engage in the following thought experiment. So like, suppose it turns out that the God of Abraham, as depicted in these texts, exists, all right? But it also turns out that this God of Abraham lacks the attributes that perfect being theology claims that God has, right? Now, in this scenario, it seems like you can move in a couple different ways. One is you could abandon perfect being theology and be like, oh, we were just like very wrong about what the divine attributes are. Or you can move in a different direction and start thinking, oh, like that's cool that the God of Abraham exists, but that's not actually God, right? God, like God as we know it, or the philosophers want to describe God, does not exist. So I think that there is this sort of like important question about what we should do if it turns out there's like this very powerful, very good, very all-knowing being that exists, but does not actually have the divine attributes that a lot of philosophers or theologians who embrace perfect being theology say belong to God. Okay, so this is sort of like the big picture, like what exactly are attributes doing and how do they help in our concept of God? How perhaps they not help? Now that we have some of these on the table, I think it is interesting to note that there are a lot of purported paradoxes, actual paradoxes relating to these attributes, all right? So many can be formed by just focusing on like one attribute and then thinking about like what it is for that attribute to be maximal or perfect in some way. So for example, there's the famous stone paradox that's supposed to create a problem for omnipotence. Can God make a stone so heavy that God cannot lift it, right? There are also paradoxes that can be created for omniscience. So for example, if you define being omniscient as God knowing all the truths, and then start thinking about what all the truths are and think, oh, maybe it's like a set that contains all the true propositions. And then you run like a Cantor's paradox operation on this. And then you realize, oh, perhaps there cannot be a set of all the truths. Then you might start worrying about what this means for omniscience. I should say that there are lots of purported solutions to these purported paradoxes, so perhaps people aren't too worried about them, but they do exist. The ones that I find more compelling are the multi-attribute paradoxes. So one famous one is that omnipotence and omnibenevolence are thought to sometimes, some people think that they create a paradox. So you might think that omnibenevolence entails that God cannot perform evil, but then omnipotence seems to entail that God can perform evil because God can perform any action. And now you get a paradox. And this is like before you start adding in other things that are not part of the concept of God, right? So once you start adding in evil, you get the problem of evil. If you start adding in change, you get a paradox for omniscience and immutability, or impassibility, sorry. And then if you add in freedom, now you get a paradox for like omniscience and freedom, right? So there are all of these sorts of problems that arise. Why do we care? So I think that one interesting feature of this is that if you drop this idea of like perfection or maximality from the property and just say like God is like extremely powerful, or God knows a ton of stuff, right? More than like any human knows, no more than like the sum of any human knows. These paradoxes actually dissolve pretty quickly, right? But then again, returning to that big picture point about what exactly is the concept of God doing for us, if these perfections are the divine attributes and we're taking them very seriously as being part of our concept of God, then dropping them also requires abandoning a particular conception of God, or just saying like God does not exist, some other like God star maybe exists. All right. Okay. Final section here, further complications. All right, so these further complications arise in Western traditions, but I think there are also analogous or like interestingly similar problems that arise for the Vaishnava concept of God. All right. So one really big question, we've talked about what these attributes are supposed to do, and also what these attributes might be and problems that arise. But we haven't really talked yet about how God relates to these attributes, right? So one view that you might have is that God is identical to God's attributes. The reason people like to say this is because God is supposed to exist, say, like not supposed to depend on anything. Sometimes we think of like ordinary objects as depending in some way of on their essence, or the essence being like explanatorily prior. But you don't want to say that about God. So then people start saying weird things like God is identical to God's essence. This is like what's proposed in the doctrine of divine simplicity. And so you start saying things like God is identical to God's attributes. Okay. Well, there's a problem. There are very puzzling things that arise once you start saying that. Like, to begin with, you might think it's weird to say that God is identical to God's attributes. But once you start down that road, even more weird things start to happen. So via transitivity, it starts to look like all the attributes must be identical to each other, and you get weird things happening there. Okay. If you don't want to commit yourself to that, maybe you have something that's like less extreme. And so Aquinas famously has this view that when we ascribe attributes to God, we do this analogically, all right? So for example, like God is good in a similar way to the way in which we can be good, but it's not exactly the same way. And it's not just like a matter of scale. So it's not just that God is like way more good than us. There's also supposed to be something slightly different about the way in which God is good as opposed to the way in which we're good. Okay, then moving like even more extreme, we have this sort of transcendence view where God transcends any attributes we might try to ascribe to God. And so you see this in apophatic theology or negative theology, where people like to say things like, oh, you can't subscribe anything substantive, like attributes to God. So you can't really say in any sense, like literal or even perhaps metaphorical, that God is good or God is powerful, etc. All right. Sometimes this is connected with a view on ineffability, where we might say that we can't really say anything of God. Perhaps we lack the correct concepts, all right? And you can see how, like, once you move down that road, then you might say, like, there are just no divine attributes that we can speak of whatsoever. Like, we don't even have a really good concept of what God is. I think that there are many problems that arise when you go down this road. So you're going to end up being committed to seemingly incompatible claims. Like you're going to end up saying things like, it's not the case that God is omnipotent. Also, it's not the case that God is not omnipotent. You might start worrying about, what about just like the general claim that God transcends these attributes? Is that a substantive claim that we can make? So this is an issue for any time you want to hold some sort of transcendence view about God transcending various divine attributes. Okay, sorry, I am almost done. Last subsection about divine personality. Okay, so in many religions, they're sort of committed to this view that God is a person or has various personalities. So already there's like an interesting question if you're committed to the transcendence view, like in what sense can you say that God is a person? Set that aside, let's say that we do have like some rough grasp of what it is for God to be a person. Presumably this involves saying something like maybe God has some agential capacities, or maybe has the ability to form some sort of relationship with creatures, right? If you buy into this idea that God is a person, you then might ask, can God have more than one personality? And so this is something that comes up very famously in like the Christian tradition, because you have these claims about the Trinity where God is supposed to be three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, right? And then there are many questions that arise in how you explain exactly what is going on in the Trinity. My understanding is that this also arises perhaps in the Vaishnava concept of God. I'm not going to talk too much about this because I don't really know anything about it, but maybe all of you can talk about this or this will come up. So my understanding is that there are similar claims that are made about Vishnu and Brahman being maybe the same person or different personalities, but there is some sort of identity relation between Vishnu and Brahman, and then you've got to explain exactly what that is, because you're also not trying to say they are like literally identical, right? Okay, so if you want to have more than one personality, then you've got to make sense of these sort of identity claims that relate to the different personalities. All right, so very famously, you have a puzzle that immediately arises in the case of the Trinity. So you want to say things like God is the Father and God is the Son, and also then it looks like you're going to have to say the Father is the Son via the transitivity of identity. Yet at the same time, you might want to say the Father is not the Son via Leibniz's law, because they have different properties, right? So like the Father is immaterial, the Son is very material, at least according to scripture, right? And so you've got to sort out exactly how to ease the tension in these four claims. Furthermore, you might want to try to do this in a way that doesn't jeopardize monotheism. And of course, this has been historically one of the big critiques of Christianity. So like Islam, for example, famously thinks that Christianity is a polytheistic tradition because of the doctrine of the Trinity. So anyway, these are like two further complications when you have like more filled out concepts of God. And yeah, okay, I think that is all I want to say for now. Thank you all for listening. I hope this promotes some good discussion.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. That covered everything. That was good. There's a lot of parallels between what you mentioned within the Christian view of different properties and attributes, to also the Indian view as well, which I'd like to get into a little bit later if we can. But first, let's see if there's some other questions, if anyone has any, or any comments anyone wants to make. And we'll move on from there. If not,
I might have a question.
Okay, so go for it, Ricardo.
Hello, Rebecca. Very nice to see you. Well, thank you very much for the presentation. Really, it covered a lot of stuff. Really good. So I have, it's perhaps more a comment than a question, but anyway, about your second section, the paradox section. Well, when you started this project, the term comparative philosophy or comparative religion came up a few times. it might seem to some people that the problems that you mentioned are kind of unique to Western religions. But in my view, perhaps I'm wrong, as long as we accept the principle of non-contradiction, which says, for instance, that an object cannot have contradictory properties. I think these problems interest all religions, unless you admit, of course, that God can be or is a contradictory object, then this paradox they dissolve. But likewise, perhaps all rational discourse dissolves. So I don't know if you have something to say about, because I know that some people have proposed, for instance, J.C. Bill, he published a book last year where he proposed to understand Christ, I mean, within a contradictory or a consistent framework. And I don't know if some people on the Hindu study side would say that it's all right to the idea that God is contradictory, but if we are not okay with that, I think somehow or other we're going to have to deal with this paradox. Well, I don't know if you have something to say about that.
Thank you. This is a really interesting thing that I am not sure. So I can tell you, like, in general, how one might approach this sort of suggestion that you propose. And I guess I am not confident enough in Eastern traditions to know what the dominant view there is. So I guess I would say that in a lot of the literature on Western philosophy of religion, most people like to maintain the principle of non-contradiction. So I would say that, like, J.C. Biel is more the exception than the rule. I do think, however, well, actually, let me back up. So there's like a very popular solution to the stone paradox that I wonder if this is like maybe more broadly applicable. So one way that people like responding to the stone paradox is the following. They say either, like, you could say the principle of non-contradiction or like classical logic or whatever, either that's true or it's not. If it's not true, then it looks like God doesn't have a problem at all, because God can both like make a stone too heavy to lift and then like not lift it. But if it is true, then it looks like this is just an impossible object. And many people think that it is not like a knock on omnipotence to not be able to do an impossible thing. And I think this sort of thing comes up also in Descartes, where Descartes talks about God being able to like change the laws of mathematics. And this is like a really weird thing to say, I think, at least in our like modern Western philosophy of religion lens. But I mean, either, and so like people wonder if this is a knock on omnipotence, if God can't change the laws of math, and it's the same sort of move. So like, well, look, if it's possible, then yeah, God can do it. And if it's not possible, then, well, it's not a knock against omnipotence, because we wouldn't expect like anyone to be able to do the impossible, right? So I wonder if there are like similar moves to be made just like in general. So it's like either we embrace classical logic or we don't. If we do, then like maybe there's a way of like understanding how we define omnipotence, omniscience, etc., in a way that it's not a knock against those things that these paradoxes arise. If it's not, then we have some pretty, as you suggest, we have some pretty quick solutions to these paradoxes.
Okay, that's enough. So let's move to Bill quickly. Oh, actually, let's do Graham quickly first. Sorry, Bill. It's just I was up there before. So Graham, go ahead.
So straight off, I mean, just picking up on the last thing that Rebecca said, it's not obvious how this is going to help with the sort of double attribute problem about omnibenevolence and omnipotence. So I wondered if Rebecca wanted to add something about that.
Yeah, thank you. I guess I was thinking more of the single paradox ones. I mean, I don't think anyone wants to suggest that like adopting paraconsistent logic is like the, for example, or like some non-classical logic is the solution to the problem of evil. I don't really think many people have suggested that, if any. So
well, indeed, I mean, more strongly than that, when J.C. Bill first started publishing his stuff, one of the first criticisms he got was, there's nothing that you can do with this that's going to deal with the problem of evil. That was like the kind of big criticism that he got straight away. I can't remember who did it, who wrote that paper, but somebody did.
mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. So I think this is right. I like cards on the table. I think this is right. I think that the move to like non-classical logic helps when you're thinking about just like the properties or the attributes themselves, and whether there's some sort of like internal problem. But I agree that once you start like meshing them together, you get these other problems that arise, and it doesn't seem right in the same way to try to resolve them with non-classical logic. Like it seems right in the just like the weird like stone paradox or whatever, right? Because there it's more like a logical problem. So if you resolved it like via some sort of logical mechanism, that seems in some sense like more appropriate. Whereas these other problems like the problem of evil, or like maybe just the problem of omnipotence and omnibenevolence, these don't seem like logical problems in the same way. They seem more like a problem with our conception of God, or like some deeper problem that it wouldn't be like appropriate to attempt to resolve with logic. I don't know that I have like some more principled way of dividing the problems, but I guess I just sort of in general agree with you and am amenable to like that addition.
Okay. So I did kind of shift away from Bill for a second, so go for it, Bill.
Okay, so of course, a paradox is not a contradiction. And I wonder if we can begin to look at this in a Kierkegaardian way, in which the paradox or paradoxical relationship, if you want to call it that, serves as some sort of dialectical purpose for directing the believer to the appropriate relationship with the divine. And I wonder if this isn't the case in other religions as well.
Yeah, this is pretty interesting. Can you say just like a tiny bit more about what you mean by directing the relationship? Or
well, I'm thinking in particular of, what is it, Sickness Unto Death, something like that, in which well, no, actually it's not the Sickness Unto Death, it's more the philosophical fragments, in which he gets into this whole purpose of the paradox, and that it's not meant to be tethered out. He claims that it's essentially unfathomable, and it's supposed to derive the, I don't know, maybe I don't remember well, there's enough about this, but it's been many years now, but someone would have to speak for Kierkegaard himself, but it looks to me like he's trying to drive you through these various phases of being in relationship with not just the divine, but because we go through the aesthetic, the ethical, and then there's the two, religious A and religious B. He wants to keep, the idea of this paradox is to keep driving you from one phase to the next. And we have this stupid story, we Westerners, about in the Eastern traditions, if you're climbing to a mountain and speaking to a guru somewhere in the East, and they say something paradoxical, you don't get it at all, but you're supposed to go away and digest it. And I think it's sort of something like that all of these, the senses of these paradoxes are driving you, maybe they're driving you away, here's my view, it's driving you away from analytic philosophy, which happened to me a long time ago, but because that's the wrong approach. Anyway, I don't know if I'm saying enough or too much.
No, this is really interesting. Thank you. I mean, one might think there are multiple approaches to understanding God or the divine. I guess this is, yeah, so some people are a fan of a more maybe like direct experiential approach. And then there are, and of course there are like various versions of, say, like fideism, where it's not so much about like the belief or arguments, right? It's more about, I don't know, faith in some other sense, maybe experience, and like the role reason is supposed to play with respect to faith. So some are like, oh, like you can't have faith if you have reason. So that's like a very strong position. Maybe like a more intermediate one is like, you don't need reason to have faith. Like maybe they're just two different ways or neither are necessary. I don't know. So I guess if that's the move one wants to make, there is still an interesting question about what that person's concept of God is. And so maybe the answer is like, oh yes, I reject this perfect being conception of God. What I care about is like my experience or with faith or whatever, or maybe like some direct relationship. And I think that's fine. I just think that a lot of the worries that relate to like the transcendence aspect, or anytime you want to say that in some way like God transcends some category, or like we lack the tools to understand God, or maybe it's ineffable. Anytime you start entering that genre, I think the same cluster of problems arise. So like, I don't know, are there any substantive things Kierkegaard wants to say about God? Setting aside like the interpretive question, I do think that it starts getting weird if you're like super committed to like, we can never say anything substantive. And so now I'm saying things like, no, it's not the case that God is loving. By the way, it's also not the case that God is not loving. And I think it gets like very difficult to understand like what you're even experiencing or like having a relationship with. I don't know, but I am also like very much indoctrinated in the analytic tradition, so maybe I'm just like failing to appreciate.
Let me just say that I think Kierkegaard rejects the resolution of the paradox.
Mm-hmm.
That paradox must remain. That there is, for example, an incarnation or Lessing's ditch. These must remain. Yeah, I mean, I have meditated on the last few passages of the philosophical fragments where he talks about this union with God, and where you can't tell the difference between who's acting. It's some sort of mystical union which he imagines. I don't know. Anyway, somebody else needs to talk, but it's interesting.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting, and I mean, one thing to say is that I don't think very many people want to say like God is literally and then like come up with a list. Like I think very few people actually say that. Like a lot of people like sort of the analogical model, or think it like something like that must be right. And so you might think that like one thing the paradoxes are doing is like forcing you to see that you're not going to come up with like the exact correct concept. And there is like some sort of gap that needs to be overcome. So like maybe it like promotes a sort of epistemic humility and some other sort of epistemic virtues with respect to religion.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, I realized I didn't mute myself while I was typing on the keyboard, so I apologize if you heard noise. So let's move over to Anand.
Okay. Hi, Rebecca. Can everyone hear me? Good. So thank you. Excellent talk. I have a couple of questions sort of moving off of what Graham Opie was talking about, and then a couple of questions towards the last section of your talk. So first, the earlier part that Graham Opie was talking about, and in addition, responding kind of to the argument you gave, that you said it was a kind of classical response these days to the Stone paradox. So one move that is in the classicist camp that I don't see a lot of people, at least when they talk about these paradoxes, invoking, which might be in the literature, and then I apologize if it's already in the literature, is just to think about quantifier domain restriction. The strategy of quantifier domain restriction to me is very powerful because in general, unrestricted quantification tends to lead to Russell's paradox, and it's a well-known studied phenomenon. And I think that that motivation itself should allow us to re-examine universal positive claims and negative ones like no or all, both of those rank of claims, and say to ourselves, what really is the quantifier what is the scope of the quantifier? And I feel like that solution on the classicist side that used the notion that this is an impossible object, so it's a knock. It's not a knock really on omnipotence. I think that's so consistent with someone who wanted to take the view that said quantifier domain restriction is always in play pretty much when we're looking at all and no. We get out of lots of problems. Just think of the classic, verification theory of meaning. Well, then it's self-refuting, blah, 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 because it's all meaning is, verification. No, it's quantifier domain restriction again. So we can start to block things and get to more substantive discussions about what we're saying instead of thinking that there's this really easy way to block it. So that's my first point. And then related to that, because Graham brought up the issue about the dual attribute problem, which is different than the single one, there's a move that's been made popular by Boris Clement in thinking about possibility and essences, where we no longer are forced to the view that modalities are all of the same rank. So the idea is some essences are higher in rank to the core of the agent or the entity that has the essence than other ones. So here's an example. Goodness is of a higher rank than power and omniscience for God. And the rank, and so this is a notion of comparative modality. So Boris has a theory of comparative modality, and it's really, really, really powerful in his book. And then what he does is he also talks about essences being ranked in a certain order, okay? And so what we can then say is because goodness is of a higher rank than omniscience and power, what we can do then is we can say that goodness trumps the other things when there's a conflict. But also, if we now invoke quantifier domain restriction, we can block single attribute problems with each of the attributes and then join it to a theory of comparative essence. So in some sense, I don't know if this kind of analytical strategy has been applied, but I feel that there's some kind of power in this way of thinking. However, I'm not sure that it's textually accurate, of course, because I've not read all the text. I'm just trying to map out a way in which logically I do see something in the metaphysics given these moves. So the two moves are and they're contemporary moves. They're quantifier domain restriction and comparative notions of essence, which still allow the things to be essences, but then allow them to be ranked, and then you can adjudicate conflicts. So now moving to the last part, which I was extremely interested in, because I haven't thought about the problem of the Trinity in a long time, but it does have an analog in Indian philosophy. I would think it has most clearly the kind of analog that comes up when Advaitins say things like Atman is Brahman. So I think in a thing like that, you can sort of start to see something that might be going on that's confusing. But the idea again here I wanted to bring in is that the is can be read in different ways. Ises can be read in ises of constitution, ises can be read as ises of identity, and they can be read as ises of predication. So I'm curious here whether or not in the case of the Trinity, if there's a move to read each of the ises as an is of predication, like we think of as John is running, we can say God is the Son, right? And so, although on the face of it, it seems like an is of identity, if we read it as an is of predication, then we have one and the same thing having these three properties. And maybe that doesn't get us out of the problem of the Trinity, but it definitely seems to make it read in a different way. Or if we read it in terms of an is of constitution, such as the thing that is God is the thing that constitutes a father, or the thing that is God is a thing that constitutes the Son. And I'm just wondering if the different senses of ises could help us in that area. Thank you very much again, Rebecca, for a wonderful talk.
Thanks, Anand. Way to sneak in 3 questions. Or 1 question, 3 parts. So let me try to go in order. So with respect to the first thing about Russell's paradox and universal quantifier, so I think what you said is correct. I have heard this before, and I've heard this I know that some people, though not in print, think that this might actually be a really interesting argument against the existence of God. And then there are people who go, oh no, this means that there's something wrong with logic or whatever, or the way we're thinking of this. So anyway, that's all to say, I do think some people have thought about the thing that you proposed. I think that the pro-theistic response would be something like, yeah, that's just like this general paradox for all of logic. So however we end up like resolving that, that's going to have some implication for like what we say about these cases. And then they don't really say much further. But I think that's correct and that's good. The second thing you said, okay, so comment and the different modes. So first, I think it's very telling that you picked goodness as the like most important essential attribute or whatever. I don't think that many, I think a lot of people prefer omnipotence, but I think that you could say that, like there's room and logical space to say that, but I think that is not the way a lot of people have thought about these things. I mean, like it would be extremely easy to just resolve a bunch of these problems if that was like on the table. So maybe like more people need to think about this proposal and take it more seriously. I don't know, I have not thought about it, so I don't want to like say too much, but I think that's like a really interesting thing, and it'd be cool to see what work can be done with it. And then the last comment with the Trinity. So yes, I agree with you. Many people try to resolve the problem by giving some account of what like is means. And like the two things you suggested are in fact two of the solutions. I haven't like thought about the Trinity for so long that I can't like tell you who holds like which solution and what the purported problem is. I can say that like the problem has to do with whether it respects like monotheism and then whether it like preserves the other like doctrinal commitments in the correct way. But yes, many people play with like the is, and they use the types of moves that you've suggested. So I think that is correct. And then I'd have to like remember exactly what various people are saying to give you a fuller response.
Okay, we have a question with Kenneth. If you go ahead, please.
Yes, I have what's most probably a very naive question for both you, Rebecca, and Graham, and that is whether process philosophy is still in the game, or if it was ever in the game, to try to address, perfect being theology. It strikes me that it was a kind of, we would say in America, an end run around so many of these problems that you mentioned. And I just wondered, is process theology, process philosophy discussed anymore? Because it strikes me that neither of you have brought this up.
Do you want to go, Graham? I saw you in mute.
Okay, so I'll say something. So I think that what is now called in analytic circles open theology is a kind of descendant from process theology. It picks out some of the things that, for example, that Hartshorne was very big on. I mean, as with lots of labels, there's diverse people who fall under the label of process theology, and not all of the different things that process theologians and process philosophers said appears in open theology. But just to give you some sense about this, for example, it's kind of typical for open theologians in a way that it isn't for perfect being theologians to suppose that God just doesn't know the future. Right, there's a kind of process of evolution and God doesn't know how it's going to turn out. So, I mean, just very quickly, I think the answer is probably yes, process theology is alive and well in certain incarnations in North American philosophy.
Rebecca, you want to add anything to that? Or?
Oh, no, I think I just agree with what Graham said.
Okay, cool. I have one really quick thing just to try to cross it over into the whole Indian thing for a second, if you don't mind. And we were talking a little bit, Anand brought up the whole thing of the Trinity and seeing, and the different examples popped up as the Vishnu Brahman one and the whole Atman Brahman one as well. But another one that pops up in the tradition I'm looking at, which is the Chaitanya Gaudiya Vaishnava one, is this Trinity of three, which is Brahman, Paramatma, which is also known as Antiramin, which is a localized aspect of God, which is within everyone, and Bhagavan, which is this transcendent, right? So you've got this unity of three, Advaya, which pops up in one of these texts, and is pursued by certain thinkers, And this is interesting because I was trying to figure out if that would work, the is as a predicate. And I was wondering, is it an is identity or whatever? But they don't quite kind of work because they're really just three, how can you say, expressions of the same entity in a sense. What different, and they did, and we were talking about attributes earlier, and they have different attributes, or what's in the Indian system called Shakti, or energies or potencies, right, which are considered to be, in some traditions, different and non-different. So you have a whole thing going on there, And so in this Trinity, the problem I've been finding, which I'm going to try to deal with, is that each one of these expressions has, some of them have contradictory attributes.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So one is immanent within everyone, which is Brahman, is everything, ubiquitous. Then you have a localized aspect, which is in only certain entities. So all of a sudden we've moved into something else. And then we have a transcendent aspect as well. And if you take those three aspects, then it becomes like a contradiction in many ways, paradoxical, and trying to figure out how that actually works and whether that works. And to use it as a predicate, I don't know, because then you have issues of, what exactly is that essence that is of three, that is, the other ones is predicated at first, I don't, it's difficult to figure out that one out. And when you use identity, you've got the problem of complete contradiction in a sense, especially of essence, So I'm wondering if that type of issue is something that is dealt with in a way within the Western analytical tradition. Is there anything that even compares with it, even analogically?
Yeah, based on what you said, I think there are a ton of parallels. So like within the Trinity, you don't even need the whole Trinity for like Christianity. You just need, I think you just need Jesus. So there are a lot of people, so there's this idea that like, because Jesus is both man and God, Jesus within like himself has different natures. So people will say things like, Jesus is both peccable and impeccable, which means like capable of sin and like not capable of sin, right? And then like so on and so forth for like whatever properties you want to say are like uniquely of humans and like uniquely of God. And then people have to tell stories about how this is possible. And I'm not like the biggest fan of very many of these stories, but I do think like it's the exact like, I think it's very close to the thing that you're describing in Indian philosophy. And there are people in the Western tradition who deal with this. I think like Tim Paul most recently has like a book on like the dual nature issue. And then of course, once you expand this to the Trinity, then you get like even more like apparent contradictory attributes. So yeah.
And how do you, with that tradition specifically, that's how they differentiate between attributes and so you expressed it in terms of an attribute, in a sense, being an essence, a core part of an essence, in a sense. Whereas they kind of distinguish it. It is, in a sense, a core part of an essence. It is, but at the same time, there's a distinguish. It can be distinguished from it as well. And the example they always use is the sun and the rays of the sun, in a sense. That you can't really distinguish between them because it's the same thing. However, they are different. And so then you end up with this, what they call beta, which means difference and non-difference, and then you try to explain it, and different schools try to explain it in different ways, and whatever. And some are logical and some are just, it's a chincha, you can't figure it out. It just can't go there type of thing. So this whole issue with, especially with these three, especially within this particular tradition, is really revolving around this idea of like non-difference and difference between attributes and essence, in a sense, So I don't know, that sounds different to the way the Christian tradition deals with it, in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, they're cluster concepts. So like some people use like nature and essence interchangeably. Some people think there's like a subtle difference. I think just the Jesus version is supposed to be like there's a dual nature. And so I guess, I don't know, there are definitely going to be different essential properties to each nature, or different essences to each nature. I don't know. I think it would be interesting to like sit down and like really sort through exactly what is meant by like attribute, essence, nature, and then see if there's like different things to say about these cases.
Yeah, that's my like inclination as well. That's my thought.